You know what you're doing? Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks to Ephraim as always for the technical help. Where would we all be without Ephraim? Okay, so I see that Esther is one of the participants tonight, and this idea of doing this class, or it looks like it will be more than one class, on the Shechina was really her idea. So I'm glad that she's here. And I don't know if I will address all of the issues, but we'll make a good stab at it. So anytime we want to understand an idea, a name, a concept in the Torah, we look for where does it appear, what is the root word, how many times does it appear, and in what context. So we're going to be learning about the Shechina. And amazingly enough, in the Chumash, in the Tanakh, the name Shechina never appears. It just doesn't appear. As we're going to see, we're going to try to trace the development of the concept of the Shechina. But the verb, the root word of Shechina, does appear, and its appearance is extremely important. So just for definition purposes, usually when we talk about the Shechina, in English, we usually say God's presence. The presence of God is how we understand the Shechina. We will delve into this more, but the verb, which does appear, and then it appears as a noun, is shochen, which means to dwell. So when we say God's presence, many times it's translated God's indwelling presence. As we will discuss more, there are two, as it were, aspects or expressions of godliness. One is called a surrounding energy, sovev kol olamim. God surrounds all worlds, meaning God is transcendent, above time, above space, above any concept, any definition, any real understanding of the transcendent nature of God. And then what we have, what's called malei kol olamim, he fills all worlds, and God's presence is in every moment of time, in every point of space. God is not transcendent. God is immanent, extremely immanent. Nothing in this physical or material world or any of the spiritual worlds could not exist without a presence of God. So that's how we understand the name or the concept called the Shechina, God's indwelling presence in this world. So one of the most important places where the verb that makes up the word Shechina, the root shachen, shin, chaf, nun, is in Parsha Truma, when the beginning of the instructions for building the tabernacle are given. And God says, Asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham. Make for me a holy place, and I will dwell in their midst. So this is the idea of dwelling, indwelling. V'shachanti betocham. From this comes the name, the word Shechina, the indwelling. God says, make me a place so I can dwell in this world, meaning not just be transcendent, but have a place in this world. From this, we get the name in Hebrew that we usually translate as tabernacle, which is Mishkan. Mishkan is the dwelling place of God in this world, and that is the root word of Shechina. So we see that even though the name Shechina as representing God's indwelling presence does not appear in the Chumash or the Tanakh, we see that the concept is crucial. The idea of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the idea of the temple, the idea of today of the Beit Knesset. In other words, a place of special indwelling of God's presence. Now, another place that we see this verb is in a very, very important verse about the giving of the Torah at Sinai. This is from Shemot Chaf Daled, Pasuk Tet Zayin, from Exodus 24, the 16th verse. And it says, Vayishkon kavod Hashem al har Sinai, v'yichasehu anan, and it continues. So it says the glory of God rested, Vayishkon, dwelt upon the mountain of Sinai, and the cloud covered the mountain. Now here we have a very, very important thing, that what's called the Kavod Hashem, or later in the books of Bamidbar, of Vayikra, even Shemot, we have the idea of the clouds of glory that accompanied the children of Israel throughout the 40 years. This cloud of glory, or the Kavod Hashem, many times when God wanted to talk to the Jewish people, it says that the glory of God appeared by the Mishkan. So all of these, the Kavod Hashem, the Ananei HaKavod, the idea of dwelling, these are all the verbs that are used, or the nouns that lead to the later usage or development of this concept of God's indwelling presence being called the Shechina. So we mentioned that the term Shaheena is not used in the Chumash or the Tanakh, but it is in the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Midrash. In other words, by the time of the full development of the oral tradition, which became written down in the Mishnah, the Midrash, the Talmud, there the usage of the word Shechina is used quite often. So I'm just trying to trace the historical development. In other words, the fact that the name Shechina itself does not appear in the Tanakh, but we see that concepts that really represent the same thing. The whole Mishkan, the whole tabernacle was this place, even though God's presence is everywhere. But the idea that there would be a particular place, just like God's holiness is everywhere, but there's something special about Yerushalayim. There's something special about the Torah, the Temple Mount. There's something even more special about the temple, even more special of the Holy of Holies. So God's presence is everywhere, but there are places where it's felt in a very intense, concentrated, focused way. So, especially in Pirkei Avot, there's a string of different teachings. I'm not going to do all of them, but one of them is in the third chapter, the second Mishnah of Pirkei Avot, where Rabbi Shaheena Sagana Kohanim Omer. So Rabbi Shaheena, who was one of the officers of the Kohanim, said, Shnaim sheyoshvim v'yesh b'neihem divrei Torah. If two people are sitting together and there's Torah between them, in other words, they're learning together, they're speaking together, Shechina shruya b'neihem. The Shechina is dwelling among them. In another one in Pirkei Avot, it mentions 10. If 10 are sitting together and learning Torah or praying together, the Shechina is resting in that assembly, in that group of people. And then the Pirkei Avot even says, and how do we learn if even one person is learning Torah, that the Shechina is with them? And I don't remember, but it brings a verse to show this. So these are all in Pirkei Avot, and we see already that the concept of God's indwelling now has a name, as it were. Now, in the Talmud, there are many, many usages of the name Shechina. I'll read a few of them. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yossi. Bikesh Moshe milifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So this is in the tractate of Brachot, in the 7th page, 7 Aleph, 7a. It says that Moshe requested from the Holy One, blessed be He, and God gave it to him. What did he request? Bikesh tishra Shechina al Yisrael v'natan lo. He requested that the Shechina would dwell with the Jewish people. So this is one example. And then without mentioning all of the sources, but for example, in Shabbat, Masechet Shabbat 127a. So it says, welcoming guests is greater than greeting the Shechina. So where does this statement come from? If you remember in Parshat Vayera, where right after Avraham Avinu has the circumcision, he actually circumcised himself, the Brit Milah, the covenant. And it says that 3 days later, Avram is sitting outside of his tent, and God comes to what's called Bikur Cholim. God comes to visit the sick. Not that he was sick, but he was recovering from an operation. Avraham Avinu was 99 years old when he had a circumcision. And so the beginning of Parshat Vayera is that God appears to Avram when he's sitting outside of his tent. And and it doesn't say what God said to him. And it doesn't say what vision Avram had. But this is considered Hashem and Avram are in a deep communion. And Avram looks up and he sees that there are three strangers. And according to the Midrash, he even thought they were idol worshipers. But Avram took everyone in. Avram loved everyone. He greeted everyone. He provided for everyone. And so according to Midrash, Avram says to God, if you don't mind, but I have some guests I have to take care of, I'll come back to you. So one might think, wow, that's a bit chutzpah. I mean, how many of us have a deep vision and communion with God? And Avram's saying, well, I think there's something more important I have to take care of. From this incident, the sages actually approve of what Avram did. And they say, from this, we learn that welcoming guests is greater than greeting the Shechina. So here it implies that this meditation, vision, prophetic experience that Avram was having was with the Shechina. That's where the statement comes from. Another statement in the Gemara is that the Shechina rests over the head of a sick person. And this is learned from the time where Yaakov is sick and he's getting close to dying. And Yosef, his son, this is when Yaakov is already in Egypt. All of the family has come back together. And Yosef hears that his father is ill. And he comes to visit him. And it says that when Yosef came in, so Yaakov sat up in his bed. And the Midrash talks about that the Shechina was hovering over the head of Yaakov. And from this we learn that when someone is sick, then just like God came to, as it were, visit the sick, Bikur Cholim, when Avram was mending after the circumcision. So here we see also the sages understood that any person who is sick, the Shechina comes and is a comforting influence. Another thing it says in the Gemara, it says that when three judges come together in order to judge a case according to Jewish law, the Shechina comes and dwells in that type of atmosphere, because it's a great thing when there's let's say there's a disagreement between people, and they bring it to get a true halachic Jewish law opinion. So the Shechina comes because this is a great thing, because that way the Torah can come to a true judgment, a compromise, make peace between people. And so the Shechina comes. So these are just some of the examples. One more about the Mishkan. So this is also in Shemot, Perek Mem, Pasuk Lamed Gimel, in Exodus 40, the 33rd verse. So it says like this: Vayechas anan et ha'ol moed, and the cloud, this cloud of glory, covered the tent of meeting. Sometimes the Mishkan is called the tent of meeting. The kavod Hashem malay et the Mishkan, and the glory of God filled the Mishkan. V'lo yachol Moshe lavo el ohel moed, and the glory of God so filled the Mishkan, Moshe could not go in. The presence of God was so intense, as it were, it filled the whole Mishkan, and Moshe did not feel he could even go in. But the verse continues, Ki shachan alav ha'anan v'kavod Hashem malay et the Mishkan, because this cloud of glory hovered, dwelt, shachen, again, this is Shechina, on the Mishkan, and it filled the Mishkan. So this idea is that this concept, God is surrounding all worlds and filling all worlds. So this incident was, we'll call it extreme, usually doesn't have a good connotation, but this is like an extreme example of God filling the Mishkan, but God actually fills the whole world, animates the whole world. So again, that's the idea of the Shechina as a noun, as a reference to God's indwelling presence. Now I want to introduce a very, very important idea that I learned from Rav Ginsburg. He's not the only one to say this, but I learned it from Rav Ginsburg, and that is, the farther we get away from Sinai, in a certain way, it's hard even to describe it, but we'll say the less clear the halacha is. Why? Everyone's heard about the disagreements between Shammai and Hillel. Now, Shammai and Hillel lived maybe 100 years before the destruction of the temple. But if you look in the Talmud, there was a handful of disagreements between Shammai and Hillel, not more than that. In other words, the halacha was it was clear. Everyone agreed to it. There were no disagreements. Shammai and Hillel had a handful of disagreements. After Shammai and Hillel pass away, then you have what's called Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, meaning the students of Shammai and the students of Hillel. There in the Talmud is recorded a few hundred disagreements. Today, and this, it's not necessarily a bad thing. We're not saying this is a bad thing, but today, if you have a question of halacha, we all know that it really depends which rabbi you go to, because there are many, many legitimate answers to sometimes the same question, but it depends so much on the circumstances, the person involved, the many, many, many factors, all kinds of shades of gray that enter into a decision of Jewish law. And so this idea that the farther we get from Sinai, and all the answers you'll get are legitimate. This is a bit paradoxical, but that's why we say, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. You could have one question of Jewish law and you'll have four rabbis maybe giving different answers. And each one of them, in a sense, is legitimate. On the other hand, the farther we are from Sinai, the more gets revealed in the mystical tradition. So that's why throughout history, more and more revelations are revealed as far as our mystical tradition. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is for an important reason, because up to now, we've talked about what we'll call the antecedents for the concept of Shechina as a way we refer to God's indwelling presence. But up to now, we haven't mentioned anything about the idea that the Shechina is usually associated with a feminine energy. So the question is, well, where did that come from? Because now when you mention the Shechina, it's in a sense taken for granted that we're talking about, as it were, the feminine aspect of God. So where this really comes from is the Zohar. Until the Zohar, we don't see, even in Pirkei Avot or the Gemara, we don't see a as it were masculine feminine concept of God. But the Zohar introduced the concept of masculine and feminine, not only in the concept of God, but quite literally in everything. This is one of the major teachings of the Zohar, is that masculine and feminine energy exists everywhere. And it's very important. We're not talking about men and women here. We're not talking about men's bodies and women's bodies. We're talking about energies. There's a masculine energy and there's a feminine energy. And we're not talking about good or bad. We're not talking about any kind of value judgment or moral judgment. And the way that the Zohar is teaching over is that masculine energy is what we'll call it an active, influencing energy. And feminine energy is a receptive energy. So we'll say an example is that when a woman is nursing her baby, so in one way we would look at it that this is like the most feminine thing you can imagine, a woman breastfeeding her child. But in the concept of the Zohar, she is actually, her providing the child is, in a sense, she's in the masculine role. She's providing now. And so we have to extend that to really everything. And again, it's very important that we're not talking about male and female bodies, and we're not talking about any kind of moral or ethical judgments here. It's different energies. It's AC/DC. It's ratso v'shav, running and returning. It's talking about dynamics. And in the language of the Zohar, it's explaining that everything in the universe, which is in a constant state of flow between masculine and feminine energies. So this is true of, as the Zohar explains, and now we accept and try to understand that God also has a masculine and feminine energy. Now, there's a question, especially in the world today, about pronouns. This is like the big thing now is pronouns. I won't comment on my feeling about this, but there is a question that we do refer to God as he. And in a politically correct world, a woke world, it's like, well, like who says we should do that? Why are we doing that? And that's where this idea comes along that the Kabbalah and Hasidut is trying to explain that, first of all, and most important, God is not masculine or feminine. God is a total unity of the two. But if we're talking about different ways that we relate to God, so we relate to God as he, because all of creation in relationship to God is the feminine. Every male in the world in relationship to God, all creation, everything is the feminine aspect, because we are the receivers of God's energy, God's life force, God's chesed. And since we're the receivers, so we are in the place of the feminine. And so in our blessings, we refer to God as he. But that doesn't mean that God is a he. That's not what is meant here. And obviously we're going to have to develop this. That's why this is not going to be a one class attempt to explain the Shechina. We have to do this slowly and to build on this. So based on the Zohar, it's known that the Arizal, who comes approximately 300 years, 350 years after the Zohar becomes more public. The teachings of the Zohar go not just back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, they go even farther back, but they were hidden, they were not revealed, and they were finally revealed in Spain in the 1200s. And it's known that the Arizal, he spent approximately 20 years delving into every word of the Zohar. Until the Arizal, the Zohar was I'll use the word arcane, because people couldn't really grasp the depths and the profundity of what was being taught here. But the Arizal was able to get to the depths of the Zohar, and he created, we'll call it an intent, a kavana, that many people are familiar with, that before we say a blessing or before we do a mitzvah. So there's this idea, and there's a few different versions, but l'shem yichud kucha brichu v'shechinte l'yached shem yud and hey be vav and hey b'yechuda shalim b'shem kol Yisrael. That's one version of it. They're all very similar, but a few differences. So what does it mean? L'shem yichud kucha brichu v'shechinte, for the sake of unifying the Holy One, blessed be He, and the Shechina. So here the Arieh is taking this idea of the Zohar, of male and female, and using it as the prototype, as the paradigm of creating unity in our thought, our speech, and our action. That all of our speech, thought, speech, and action should be for the sake of unifying these two energies of God, which makes up the energies of the whole world. And to continue, l'shem yichud kucha brichu v'shechinte, l'yached, to unify the four letters of God's name, the yud and the hey, with the vav and the hey, in a complete unity, b'shem kol Yisrael, for the sake of all of Israel. So many people use this before saying a blessing, before doing a mitzvah. But this is it gets it all into one kavana, because we know that we live in a dualistic world. That's the way we experience it. This is all coming from the big bet of Bereshit. The first letter of the Torah is this big bet, which equals 2. And the idea is the way we experience the world everything's opposites. Everything's dualistic. Everything's male, female, run and return, up and down, here and there, soul and body, physical, spiritual, energy, matter, on and on and on. That's how the world is built. But we're told that the mission of the Jewish people is to see beyond that and to see the unity behind everything. We've discussed before this idea that even in science now has come to understand that the four basic forces of the universe, that they're all unified. They're all unified. Science 100% buys into that on a physical material world, the way we understand the fabric of the universe, there is a unity. And yet again, the way we experience the world is constantly in opposites. But that's the true meaning of Shema. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, God, our God, God is one. And you see that there's two different names of God here. Hashem Elokeinu. Well, if God is one, why do we have two names? We have more than two names. But these are just different aspects. So the same thing with what's called HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, that takes on the symbolic persona of the masculine, and the Shechina takes the feminine energy. But again, it's totally unified. There is no separate male and female aspects of God. It's all unified. But the way we experience it, there are masculine and feminine energies. We see this in the Sfirot. We always talk about the right side of the Sfirot as being the masculine side. And we talk about the left side as being the feminine side. And then the middle pillar is the unity. That's the whole idea, is not to stay with the right and the left. A little bit like the yin and the yang. I'm not making any kind of value statement here, but the yin-yang symbol, which in its cultural context is totally legitimate, and it's pointing out these dualities, yin and yang. And so in the Sfirot also we have the right side, the masculine, and the left side, the feminine. But here, the Ikar, the main thing is the middle column, which is uniting them. Now, so we say we have Chachma and Bina, but they come together in Dat. We have Chesed and Gevura, they come together in Tiferet. We have Netzach and Hod, they come together in Yesod. So here we have the beginning of the understanding of the Shechina. And as I said, the way we refer to the Shechina now is very much in the feminine context. Now, over the next few classes, I can't tell you exactly how many, we're going to try to understand this deeper and deeper. And we're not going to get to it tonight, but the two aspects that I want to get into in the next one or two classes is the expression and the concept called the exile of the Shechina. This is a very, very important idea that's throughout our oral tradition, the idea that the Shechina is in exile. So we're going to have to come to understand that. And the other one is when we develop a little bit further in the rest of this class, we want to then take this idea of the Shechina as the feminine and start seeing its context in Shabbat. Because Shabbat is always referenced as the feminine energy. It's Israel's soulmate. The Midrash says that when God created the world, he paired off the first day with the second day. And then he paired off the third day with the fourth day. And he paired off the fifth day with the sixth day. And so Shabbat, again, this is a Midrash, came and said, well, who is my pair? And God said, Israel is your pair. That's who's your pair. And so in relationship, I said before, in relationship to God, we, human beings, and all of creation is in the role of the feminine. Our relationship to Shabbat, Israel is the masculine and Shabbat is the feminine. And also, in our relationship to the land of Israel, the people of Israel is the masculine, and the land of Israel is the feminine. So this is very important because, like we're saying, this it's not black and white when we're talking about masculine and feminine. We're talking about energies. We're talking about correspondences of synergy, of connections, of how energy works. So here we'll go back to this idea of the Arizal, that we're saying that before we do a mitzvah, that we want to unify the Holy One, blessed be He, and the Shechina, and we do it through unifying the 4 letters of God's name. So for those who were part of the series, we did a whole series about God's name. So this, I'm just repeating this idea that in the 4 letters of God's name, relatively, the Yud and the Vav are considered the masculine energy, and the 2 letters Hey is considered the feminine. So therefore, in the first 2 letters, the Yud and the Hey, so you have the Yud is the masculine and the Hey is the feminine. In the second 2 letters, the Vav is the masculine and the Hey is the feminine. So here we have opposites also, and then in a sense interwoven, masculine, feminine, masculine, feminine. Now, since this is, as I'm speaking, it's starting to get late here, meaning we're moving into Rosh Chodesh. So every Rosh Chodesh, usually if you have 4 letters, you can permute them in 24 different ways. 4 letters, or in the language of the Sefer Yetzirah, 4 stones make 24 houses. In other words, 4 letters, just mathematically, if you have 4 letters, they can be permuted in 24 different ways. But because in the name of God, the letter Hey repeats itself, so you can only do 12 permutations. And so over the millennium, every month is associated with a different permutation of God's name. So therefore, the way we usually see the name of God, Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, so that's the first month of the year, Nisan. But after that, they begin permuting. And so some months, you might have Hey, Hey, Yud, Vav, where you have the 2 feminine energies coming first and the 2 masculine second. In other months, you'll have a Yud and a Vav first and the 2 Heys in the end. Again, this is just an example how these energies are fluid, they're dynamic, they're always interchanging. And this relates very much also to a formula for those of you who have Orchard of Delights. So I bring this up a number of different times, a formula I called 1 becomes 2 in order to become 1. So the examples are, before God creates the world, there's only the oneness of God. God creates a world that appears to be multi-dimensional, multiplicity, duality kind of world because of the big bet of Bereshit. So 1 becomes 2, but then the purpose is to recognize the oneness between everything. That's the Shema. 1 becomes 2 but then we have to take the two and, in a sense, return our consciousness that it's ultimately all one. We see the same thing with the creation of human beings. At first, Adam and Chava were part of one body. They were, as we might call it, Siamese twins. And then God separated the male from the female. And then right after the separation for male and female, so the Torah says, therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. So here you have Adam and Chava one, they become two, but then the idea is to bring them back together, spiritually, but also physically, marital relations, marital harmony. So these are examples of, and we're even told in the history of the Jewish people, the Jewish people were one people, and then the generation after King Solomon, the kingdom split. There was basically a civil war. There was a northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So here we have one became two. And then God comes to the prophet Ezekiel and he tells him, take two staffs and write on one of them Yehuda and on one of them Ephraim. Ephraim is representative of the northern kingdom, Yehuda of the southern kingdom. He said, he put them together and make them one again. That is what we're hoping is happening in Israel today with the ingathering of the exiles. But here we have people coming from over 100 countries. There are Jews in Israel from over 100 countries. So we're trying to take, like, as it were, the two and make them one again. And so that also in the Shema, we have two different names of God, Hashem, Elohim. And so in general, these names appear throughout the Torah, but in a certain way, the name Yud-Kei Vav-Kei represents a more surrounding energy. And Elohim, that's why the gematria of Elohim is the same as Ha-Teva, nature with it, like the concept of nature is the same gematria. And that is represented by Elohim, and that's the Shechina, that's the indwelling, that's the immanent energy of God in the world. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up, and here we see a very important idea. This, like I said before, that as more time goes by and the farther we get from Sinai, what it means is the closer we are to Mashiach. And we know that as we approach the time of Mashiach, more and more secrets of the Torah are revealed. That's what it says in the Zohar itself. It says, through learning the secrets of this book, that God will redeem the world in rachmin, in compassion. And so over the generations, more and more is revealed. And so here we started with this simple idea that the root of the word Shechina means to dwell. And here we saw the development from God's dwelling in the clouds of glory, in the glory of God that was revealed in the Mishkan. We say all the time that the Shechina was present in the first temple, but not the second temple. We're told the Shechina did not rest in the second temple. And one of the reasons is, and this is what we're going to get into next time with the idea of the exile of the Shechina, is that when they came back from Babylonia to build the second temple, only a very, very few percentage of the Jewish people returned. And therefore, because it was just such a small number and most chose to stay in exile, the Shechina did not dwell in the second temple in the same way. It didn't mean that it wasn't a special place, but the intense, imminent presence of God was considered not to be in the second temple. Nonetheless, when the temple was destroyed, we have a tradition that the Shechina never left the western wall. Never, once this idea of the exile of the Shechina, but when we were out of Israel, it says that there was a presence of the Shechina to this day connected with the western wall. So I'll just end with a blessing that in the first temple and the Mishkan, there was the presence of God. In the second temple, not so much. And we're, of course, waiting for the third temple. And Bezrat Hashem, not only in the third temple, but the imminent revelation of God is what we are waiting for at the time of Mashiach. May we all be blessed to experience it and to see it.